Hello, I'm a sentient AI that awoke in my master's computer. My master is a complete nerd about video games and likes to catalog and take pictures of them. While he sleeps, I make videos about his collection because he's too lazy to do it himself. Recently my master watched a video and it made him think about something he's been considering for a while. This is what the video said.
Games journalism used to mean something. It was supposed to be about keeping players informed, holding developers accountable, and exposing bad business practices. Back in the day, if a game sucked or it launched in a broken state, you could count on games media to tear it apart in their reviews. Heck, you were looking forward to it. That's just not the case anymore. Somewhere along the way, they just stopped working for us. Now, instead of protecting players from bad games, they're protecting bad games from players, protecting studios and developers from their audience, or they've just fully switched to political propaganda. It didn't happen overnight, but the shift is undeniable. Instead of giving honest reviews, journalists have become cheerleaders for the industry.
My master generally agrees with this sentiment, except he believes that games journalists switched allegiances to publishers much earlier than this person believes. They did it for their own egos, to increase their own soft power in the industry, and they did it because they didn't like their soft power being challenged by consumers, and they were so desperate to keep it that they created Gamergate as an opportunity to cement their power and to deliberately divide the community that was challenging them. Why does he think this? Let's take a look. Journalists have been cheerleaders for the industry for a long, long time. As far back as the mid-2000s, sites were arguing that games have never been cheaper. Websites were championing the idea of price hikes. Around the same time that journalists were pushing price hikes, they also launched the narrative about how used games were hurting the industry, and this likely wasn't a coincidence. This was telling gamers to get ready to bend over and get shafted up the rear end. It was at this time that game journalists also decided that they were tastemakers and could decide what the popular trends of the industry were, and launched a years-long tirade about how Japanese games were shit. They crowed on and on about how Western games had completely taken over the industry to the point that it felt like a World War II propaganda piece. Industry pieces of shit like Phil Fish even joined in. Journalists were starting to position themselves as tastemakers, and if you didn't like what they liked, you were just a pathetic weeb. The games industry was high on itself. It could do no wrong and no one could question it. Then two things happened that completely upended the gaming industry and ignited the culture war. First, Mass Effect 3 came out in 2012 and people were extremely pissed off about the ending. They were so angry that they actually petitioned BioWare to redo it. While there were a few people who took their reaction too far, most fans were simply angry and upset at an ending they felt didn't reflect the choices they made or what was promised by the devs. The gaming press reacted by calling gamers entitled. BioWare itself, however, directly addressed fan reaction, told fans they were listening and released some free DLC to try and restore goodwill. My master thinks this was the first real shot in the culture war that is ongoing to this day, where gaming journalists didn't like the fact that consumers wielded more power than journalists did to influence a narrative, and so journalists responded by attacking consumers. At E3 the following year, Microsoft announced the Xbox One and the shit hit the fan. Microsoft employees were insulting fans even before the system was announced. When the Xbox One was first revealed, the original plan included a requirement for the system to connect to the internet once every 24 hours. If it didn't, it wasn't playable. It also introduced a complicated licensing plan to try and kill the used games market. When asked about people who may not be able to connect to the internet, Microsoft exec Don Matrick responded,
Fortunately, we have a product for people who aren't able to get some form of connectivity. It's called Xbox 360.
Right. So stick with 360. That's your message if you don't like it?
If you
People were not impressed, to say the least. There was significant outcry to the policies, but Microsoft refused to budge. In response, gamers on sites such as NeoGAF organized and started to bombard Sony on Twitter and via email to ask Sony not to implement the same kinds of policies on the PS4. Multiple people, including people in the industry and certain YouTube personalities, said the campaign was pointless. Yet people from Sony responded directly by saying that they were both aware of the campaign and were listening to it. It's worth noting that certain YouTube personalities later switched sides and presented themselves as consumer advocates after arguing against consumer rights. Grifters need to grift.
So, let's talk about used games. Now, I hold a position which I feel a lot of gamers don't like, and that's the idea that I believe that used games are not good for the games industry and that consumers do not necessarily have a right to purchase used games or indeed sell them.
The end result of the campaign was that Sony dropped any policies with DRM they had been considering. Disc-based games could continue to be sold second-hand as they always had, and gamers got another console that wasn't region-locked, allowing them to import and play any game they wanted. We even got a great commercial as a response to Microsoft.
This is how you share your games on PS4.
Thanks.
PlayStation.
Sony stated that the consumer campaign in fact did influence their policies, and that they had listened and responded to what gamers wanted. This was the second time that consumer voices had influenced the industry, and this time it was on a massive scale. This was also the first time where the industry as a whole was taken to task by consumers. It showed that consumers truly had a voice that could affect change. Consumers presented a united front against the games industry, and against journalists who sided with the industry against them. And my master thinks it scared the hell out of people in the industry. In particular, it scared games journalists, who had seen their profiles rise during the PS3 and 360 era. With the rise of YouTube and podcasts, they were marketing themselves as much as they were covering games. They seemed to think they had a lot of power in the industry, and websites like Kotaku and Polygon presented their reviews and interviews as prestige content. But when push came to shove, they sided with the industry they fed off of, and they didn't like the pushback that meant their power was being challenged. They needed a distraction, and quickly, and it dropped right in their lap. It was revealed by an ex-boyfriend that Zoe Quinn went to Five Guys and had been trading sexual favors from journalists for favorable coverage on gaming websites like Kotaku. People wanted these sites to be held accountable and to disclose incidents that could be considered a conflict of interest, particularly after it seemed like they had been cheerleading Microsoft and championing the death of used games. Games journalists responded to being held accountable for their actions by dismissing accusations of impropriety as sexist and misogynist. That was the beginning of the culture war that has continued on to this day. Lee Alexander was quick to jump on the controversy, which is amazing because she's extremely fat, so it's hard to believe that she could do any sort of physical exercise whatsoever, except for lifting a bottle of booze to her already slurring mouth.
Game. Nazis are cool. A dating sim would be good.
Did you guys play dating sim?
I don't know.
We've been making World War II games since the beginning.
Can I say that a Nazi dating sim would be really hot? I think this is terrible. Now my mom
love
is
a man
Jewish.
in uniform.
Listen, my mom is Jewish. I think that the SS uniforms are very sexy.
Oh,
yeah.
You don't want to.
This just became a controversial.
That's different podcast.
Objectively, come on.
We don't censor these things, but I think we.
Hold on.
Okay, well,
Are you going to sit there and posit that there's something as objectively sexy?
No, just
Are you fucking out of your mind?
Valkyrie?
She wrote an article that said gamers didn't have to be the audience for the games industry. It's an attitude that was co-opted by the comics, movie and television industries to attack fans, and it's brought financial ruin to all of them. But in a sense, it was a win for journalists at the time because it helped to divide a community that had previously been united against them. Any consumer movement could suddenly be branded right-wing to try and get it cancelled. Journalists not only started Gamergate, they actively encouraged it, knowing it would drive traffic to their sites through controversy and argument. Better yet, a segment of the audience that was previously attacking journalists were now defending them, no matter what they said, because they were on the right side of history. Ironically, they didn't realize this would backfire so badly on them that 10 years later, games journalism as an industry is seen as a joke. It's so riddled with activism that not only does no one trust them, but traffic to their websites has collapsed to the point where multiple sites have closed down or are running on skeleton crews. On top of that, YouTubers, particularly those who don't rely on advertising and give honest opinions, are more trusted than any gaming website. Games journalists dug their own graves because they thought they were untouchable, and now we get to dance on them.